The sun was going down when my friend Tammy and I were driving south through a tiny place in Montana. As we went by the homes, we looked around and realized that despite the evening setting in, not a single light was on anywhere. It was a summer evening around 9 p.m., and it felt a bit creepy. We nervously laughed, thinking maybe the folks here hit the sack early. Our destination was an old century-old cabin for rent that was located far off on a twisty road that ran through a couple of farmlands. By the time we reached the quaint structure, it was pretty dark. It felt even darker as the cabin was nestled among trees at the base of a huge rock face. We used a combo lock to open the door, unloaded our car, and planned to get a fire going in the wood-burning stove. I used a flashlight to unlock the shed that was filled with wood, but when I tried to chop some kindling, I realized the axe handle was broken. I transferred some wood into the bin on the small front porch. We headed over to the campground across the road to use the toilet and get ready for bed. It was pitch black, and the campground was nearly deserted, with just one RV occupying a spot. Feeling a bit jittery and worn out, we returned to the cabin and locked the bolt for the night. We got into our sleeping bags and started to drift off to sleep. I usually doze off fast, but I'm also a light sleeper. I was awakened by Tammy whispering, "There's someone outside." I thought I heard some movement, and it sounded like someone was trying to open our car doors. Tammy whispered again, saying someone opened the wood bin. We thought it was the people in the RV taking our firewood. Then the sounds became louder. There was a racket all around the cabin, and it sounded like someone was bending a metal pie dish. I started to think that I may have forgotten to lock the woodshed in the dark, and someone was taking all the wood. The cabin's layout meant that the window shutters were locked with padlocks from the outside, leaving us with no way to peek outside. We were too terrified to open the front door to check what was going on. Eventually, we managed to fall asleep. Waking up the following morning, we were eager to assess what might have happened outside. We got dressed and stepped out. In the broad daylight, things didn't appear as scary as they had the previous night, and we were surprised to find that nothing seemed out of place. The woodshed was locked. The bin was filled with firewood and a small fuel can. There were no footprints, and no other evidence that anyone or anything had been there besides us. We spent the day touring the surrounding area and returned to the cabin that evening. We considered leaving the shutters open to have a look outside, but decided it wouldn't make us feel safe, so we kept them locked. We had a small fire going and locked the door's bolt for the second evening. This time, sleep didn't come to me as easily. I kept my ears open for any tiny sound, but soon I didn't have to strain much. The rustling noises were back, surrounding us once again, and they were louder than the previous night. We found ourselves laughing uncontrollably as we heard what seemed like small creatures running back and forth over the roof. It sounded like something was dragging heavy stones outside. We chatted in low voices, trying to keep ourselves from shrieking in fear. Then, it sounded like someone was trying to unlock the padlock on the shutter, which was situated above the windows, nearly 7 feet off the ground. We weren't going to step outside. We had no idea what was out there. All we could do was lay there and endure the situation. Eventually, the noises faded, and we managed to get a bit of sleep. We quickly packed up in the morning and once again found nothing amiss outside. We definitely won't be returning to that spooky little cabin again. I was just a 22-year-old dude, and all this stuff started when I was about 10. My folks decided to take my younger brother Jake and me to our uncle's mountain cabin for a summer vacation. Our uncle had had the place for a few years already. Getting there took about 5 hours from where we lived, so we left right after school on a Thursday, all geared up for the adventure that lay ahead. We had to use my dad's work truck for the journey, because our car just couldn't handle the tough mountain roads. My dad was cool with that, as he worked in a construction company that let him use the truck. By the time we arrived, the sun was nearly set, and it would be pitch black in less than an hour. The cabin was set in a small open space in the forest, with its wooden body blending in perfectly with the surrounding trees and bushes. Inside, the place had a charming old-school vibe. There was just one big room with a kitchen, living area, and a full-sized bed crammed into the corner, which was reserved for my parents. Jake and I got the loft upstairs, which had a tiny round window overlooking the twisty driveway leading up to the cabin. After we had unloaded our stuff and gotten comfortable, it was time to call it a day. I was super tired, and my younger brother Jake, who was 2 years my junior, quickly fell asleep. But as usual, I had a hard time dozing off. It's always been tough for me to sleep in new places, even now. I expected a restless night, drifting in and out of sleep. My parents stayed up chatting softly, not wanting to disturb us. The loft was open to the rest of the cabin, but I couldn't hear what they were discussing, nor was I interested. I guess I could have found out if I tried hard enough, but I couldn't be bothered. Suddenly, around midnight, a knock on the cabin door disrupted the quiet. I heard my dad get up and walk towards it, while my mom whispered something to him. Curiosity got the better of me, and I silently peeked over the loft railing to check out who was at the door. I saw my dad look out the front window without opening the door. Then another knock sounded, louder and more forceful this time. After that, my dad cracked open the door and stepped outside, shutting the door behind him. My mom just stood there, nervously twiddling her thumbs. It was obvious that she was seriously worried. I was really freaked out and curious at the same time, but too scared to get down from the loft. I crept up to the front window, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was happening outside. In the driveway, right in front of the cabin, stood 2 pickup trucks that didn't belong to us. Their headlights were on, and I could see at least 3 men loitering around them. One of them definitely had a gun in his hand. As soon as I saw that, I ducked under my blanket and covered my ears. Even with my hands over my ears, I could hear the door opening and closing once more. Gathering my guts, I decided to peek over the edge of the loft again. I was relieved to see it was only my dad coming back in. My parents started whispering again, but I could only catch bits and pieces. Something about, "We'll leave in the morning," my dad said. By the time the sun came up, I had hardly gotten any sleep. I could feel that something was not right, and sure enough, my dad called us over to the breakfast table, a worried look on his face. He told us we had to pack up and leave the cabin immediately, but didn't explain why. Jake grumbled a bit, but I kept quiet. He'd slept through the whole thing, so he had no idea what was going on. I wanted to ask my dad about the previous night's events, but he was a pretty stern guy. When he made a decision, it was final. He asked me not to question it, so I didn't. My parents stayed quiet about the whole thing, hiding what seemed like a pretty disturbing truth from us. As we packed up our stuff and got ready to head home, I was left feeling confused and scared. We left the cabin and never returned. The memory of that night has stuck with me throughout the years, always making me wonder who those men were and what they wanted from us. My dad never shed any light on that night, even after all these years. I get why he didn't tell me when I was a kid, but I don't understand why he keeps it a secret even now. And my mom's no different. The one thing I do know is that around the time of the incident, our uncle, the owner of the cabin, got caught dealing drugs. He ended up serving a few years in jail for that, and as a result, the cabin was taken away from him. My best guess is that my uncle got on the wrong side of some dangerous dudes, and they had come to sort things out with him. If that was the case, we were lucky that they let us go. Not everyone might have been as lucky. A few years back, my buddy Tommy and I went for a hike, and something really spooky took place. We'd picked a place a couple of hours away from our tiny hometown. The place wasn't really an official hiking route, but we had a reliable map, and we were quite familiar with the broad layout of the area. When we got there, the air was fresh and had the smell of pine and a little smoke. Pretty normal for where we live. I parked our car, and we put on our backpacks, making sure we had all we needed for the trip. With our solid boots tied up tightly, we began our journey. The time was a little past 10 in the morning. Our path took us through a thick forest, sunlight poking through the trees and the leaves up above. Every couple 100 feet, there was a white mark on a tree indicating the path. In the first few hours, we lost our way and found it again a few times. It felt like we might lose our path permanently, but we weren't scared. I had my GPS for any emergency. As we moved deeper into the wilderness, the ground began to change. The path was less clear, and we had to depend on our map and gut feelings to move ahead. The beauty of the environment made the whole thing worth it. After hiking for another hour, we were pretty certain we were lost. We hadn't spotted a trail marker for quite a while, and I started to worry that we might have strayed into private property, something that can get you in trouble where I come from. Suddenly, we spotted an old cabin in the distance. The building was old and weather-beaten, like no one had taken care of it for years. Out of curiosity, and even though we knew we shouldn't, Tommy and I carefully walked towards the cabin. As we got closer, it looked even more run down than we'd imagined. The wooden steps creaked under us as we climbed up to the front door. We went inside through the open door, our eyes getting used to the dim light coming in through the broken windows. The air inside was stale and there was a nasty smell. As we looked around inside the cabin, we found traces of the people who'd lived there before. There were jars filled with a mysterious yellow fluid on the dusty shelves. It could have been pee, but I didn't really know why anyone would do that. On the table, there was a stack of old, faded magazines, their pages worn and yellow. Among the old pictures, we noticed something unsettling. The eyes of all the people in the magazines had been torn out. It was like a scene from a horror film. Tommy thought it was all set up to scare us, like some kids made it look spooky for hikers to stumble upon, but I felt it was genuine. The air was filled with a strong, unpleasant smell like decaying meat. We tried to find where the smell was coming from, but had no luck. After less than 10 minutes, we left the cabin. It was still early, but we decided to turn back. We hadn't planned for an overnight trip, so we needed to keep track of time. What we didn't know was that our spooky experience wasn't over yet. As we made our way back along the path, we ran into a man. He looked out of place, without any hiking equipment. Moreover, he was heading in, even though it was getting late. He greeted us with a forced smile, saying he was just out for a hike. We quickly moved on, looking back now and then to make sure he wasn't following us. He was going towards the cabin. Finally, we reached our car, parked near the trail's entrance. On our way out, we didn't see any other vehicles parked around, so we didn't know how that man got there. I suspect he was living in that cabin. Either way, he was a strange guy, and I'm glad we didn't stumble upon that place while he was there. My partner and I decided to have a getaway to my dad's hunting lodge in the north part of West Virginia, just a couple of counties away from Point Pleasant. We loaded all our stuff into the pickup the night before, so we could head off at the crack of dawn the following day. We woke up early, too excited to sleep in any longer. Our drive to the lodge was smooth, and we reached the nearby town where we stocked up on food. About an hour later, we were on a gravel road heading towards the lodge. The lodge was located around 50 miles into the wilderness, away from any town or city. It's a super remote and sometimes spooky place. We drove on the bumpy road for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the lodge came into view. We were both drained from the journey and looked forward to unwinding by the fireplace and watching some movies once we'd emptied the bags and put away the food. Once everything was inside, we started preparing dinner. My boyfriend, let's call him Nick, went out to collect some firewood. By 7, the sun was going down, and we made sure all the doors and windows were secure. The lodge is a cozy one-bedroom place with around 5 windows and 2 doors. This detail will be crucial later. After tidying up, we decided to watch Catch Me If You Can on DVD, so nothing terrifying. I wanted a smoke, but realized my pack was empty. I asked Nick where the rest of the cigarettes were, and he pointed to the truck. He then offered to fetch them, but I told him no. Then I put on my shoes and walked towards the door. I've always been spooked by the dark, so I've despised stepping outside in the dark as far as I can recall. I turned back to Nick and asked him if he would stand at the front door while I went to the truck. He agreed and walked over. I cautiously went outside and down the steps to the truck. As I was grabbing the box of cigarettes, I heard a strange sound. Initially, it sounded like a woman shrieking, then it turned into a howl. It was as if those sounds blended together to create one eerie sound. Honestly, it's tough to describe. It sounded like a cross between a demon and a werewolf. I sprinted towards the cabin and saw Nick's face pale as a ghost. I pulled him inside and questioned him about that sound. It took him some time to respond, but he eventually said he didn't know. I grew up hunting and fishing in the woods with my dad and brothers, and I had never heard an animal make that noise before, I told him. Then we heard it again, but it was closer this time, right by the living room window. Nick rushed to the bedroom to fetch his handgun while I pulled out my dad's hunting rifle from the wardrobe. I'd never felt such fear in all my life. I kept thinking, what if this creature tries to invade our cabin? Then we heard it again at the front door. I took aim at the door, my small hands trembling. Even though I'm just a 5'4" woman, I was ready to fight this beast if it tried to step inside. Then we heard the scream again, but it was no longer at the door. It was at the kitchen window. Nick and I stood back, guns prepared. Then we heard a crunching noise as if metal was being crushed. We were too petrified to move. After an hour of standing like that, we didn't hear anything else. We slowly moved to the kitchen window to check if we could see anything. Nick, being taller, looked first and he gasped, "Oh no, it's torn a hole in my truck." I peeked out the window and saw a massive hole ripped into the door. We double-checked all the windows and doors to make sure they were locked. We stayed awake all night, frightened that the creature would return. When morning came, we decided to examine the truck. Nick went out first, pistol at his side while I held the hunting rifle. Approaching the truck, we noticed claw marks from the tail light all the way to the passenger door and a massive hole punched into it. We hurried back inside and contacted the forest ranger. He arrived about 3 hours later, inspected our truck, and shared that, over the past 6 months, 12 people had disappeared from that region. Moreover, nearby farms had reported hearing the same noises we heard the previous night. The next morning, the farmers would find their livestock either missing or slaughtered. He advised us it would be safer to leave until they could identify the animal causing this havoc. He looked frightened and pale himself. He confessed that he didn't want to spend too much time up there, but offered to wait for us to pack up and escort us to the main road. We didn't need any further prompting. We hurled our belongings into the truck and sped down that gravel road. Upon reaching the main road, we expressed our gratitude and continued our journey. As far as I know, they have never discovered any creature or person capable of causing such destruction in those woods. We haven't returned there since. We didn't see the creature, and I'm grateful we didn't, but I am certain that no animal could make those sounds or inflict that kind of damage to a truck, not even a bear.